get to grips with a filmmaker as singular as Andrzej Żuławski, it's probably a good idea to go right back to the beginning. Żuławski was born in what was then the Polish city of Lwów in 1940. It's now the Ukrainian city of Lviv and has been since the end of World War II. Żuławski was not the first culturally significant Żuławski. There are in fact quite a few, the most notable being the science fiction writer Jerzy Żuławski, whose great uncle he was, and of course he would subsequently adapt his Moon trilogy for On the Silver Globe a few years later. His father, Mirosław, was also a writer, but his day job was as a diplomat. In 1945, Mirosław Żuławski became the Polish cultural attaché in Paris, and so he moved his entire family there, and that's where and Żuławski went to a French-speaking school, and that's where his command of the French language was first nurtured. They then spent some time in Prague, and then by 1956 they were back in Paris again because Mirosław had got a job working with UNESCO, and that's where Andrzej completed his schooling. Between 1957 and 1959, Andrzej Żuławski studied at the Institut des Hautes Études Cinématographiques, which is the main film school in Paris. Graduated from there, and he then went to the Sorbonne to study philosophy, and from there transferred to Warsaw, so we're now in the early 60s. He started moving in film circles, and thanks to a mutual contact in Roman Polanski, who was then a very recent Łódź Film School graduate, Andrzej Żuławski managed to get a job working as assistant to Andrzej Wajda, a job that he held on 3 of Wajda's films. There was his Holocaust drama Samson in 1961, his contribution to the international portmanteau film Love at 20 in 1962, where Żuławski's knowledge of French came in very handy, and the 4-hour epic 1965 Napoleonic epic Ashes, not to be confused with the much better known Ashes and Diamonds, and that would have occupied a fair chunk of the mid-1960s. Żuławski made his professional directing debut in 1967 with 2 short films for Polish television, both of them co-written with his father Mirosław. There was Pawoncello, which was actually broadcast in 1967, and The Song of Triumphant Love was broadcast in 1969. But now, although it's fascinating pouring through early Żuławski films to try and get some hint of the explosion that was to come, there's fairly slim pickings there. Certainly there is nothing that anticipated the aesthetic shock of the third part of the night. Now, by 1971, it wasn't at all unusual for Polish filmmakers to try to come to terms with the experience of World War II. It's one of the, the indelible event that scarred the Polish psyche in the 20th century, and no wonder. I mean, depending on which historian you believe, anything up to a fifth to a quarter of the Polish population perished between 1939 and 1945, and certainly the older generation of Polish filmmakers would have had teenage and sometimes even early adult memories of life under Nazi occupation. And of course, when they became filmmakers, they poured it into their films. The Andrzej Wajda's first 4 films, there's the famous war trilogy, A Generation, Canal and Ashes and Diamonds, and a much more obscure 4th film called Lotna, in part drew on his experience as a teenage courier for the Polish Home Army, sort of one of the main Polish anti-Nazi and in fact anti-Soviet resistance organizations. There was Andrzej Munk, slightly older, who had a World War II backdrop for 3 out of his 4 features. There's Eroica, Bad Luck, and The Unfinished Passenger, which he was in mid-production on when he died in a car crash at the age of just 40. And he took a rather more sort of sardonic and sarcastic approach to World War II that was sort of quite far removed from Wajda's more sort of romantic sort of glorification of the sort of Polish resistance heroes. There was Jerzy Skolimowski, who he didn't actually make a film set during World War II, but his 5th feature, Hands Up, does make a bleak reference to the gas chamber in which his own father perished. Loads and loads of other examples. I mean, there are plenty. World War II is just a recurring topic in Polish cinema. But Żuławski took a completely different approach, because what is usually apparent in a Polish World War II film, you know who the good guys are, you know who the bad guys are. There may be a little bit of ambiguity here and there, but you have you know what people are fighting for. Even in a situation like Vida's Ashes and Diamonds, where the hero is completely conflicted as to what he's fighting for, you do know that he's not on the side of the Nazis, he's not on the side of the Soviets. He is trying to stand up for his notion of a sort of perfect Poland. Now, this doesn't happen in The Third Part of the Night at all. It is very much staged as a hallucinatory nightmare. It's not immediately clear that The Third Part of the Night is a World War II film at all. It opens in a house that could be anywhere from the mid-19th century onwards, with this young woman, Helena, reading a passage from the Book of Revelation. The only suggestion that the things are not quite what they seem being that it's one of the more apocalyptic passages from the Book of Revelation. And then shortly afterwards, this being a Żuławski film, she and her son Łukasz get horribly murdered by armed horsemen, all this of course being witnessed by both her father and her husband, the entirely understandably horrified Michał. And the rest of the film revolves around Michał, who is this sort of, again, as the same actor Leszek Teleszynski would play in The Devil. He's a really sort of horrified everyman figure. He tries to intervene occasionally in the events that are swirling around him, but is usually fairly powerless. And in fact, the third part of the night is so calculatedly hallucinatory in its approach that fairly early on it is quite clear that what we are seeing is not necessarily what is actually transpiring for real. There's this woman, Marta, who is the absolute spitting image of his dead wife, Helena, unsurprisingly, because she's played by the same actress, Żuławski's then wife, Małgorzata Braunak. She gives birth, and he actually has to assist with a really alarmingly realistic birth, which he immediately is reminded of his son Łukasz. Later on, he will see his own double, which is a reminder that the whole notion of the doppelganger is something that has a very, very long tradition in literature. And it also reinforces the whole impression of this completely topsy-turvy looking glass world that's an inversion, even a perversion of the real world. What we don't get to see much of is the Nazi occupation. We are verbally told more than once that the Gestapo are around. We see a motif that we see more than once is someone being shot randomly in the street. But again, we don't see who's actually doing the shooting. We assume it's the Nazis, might not necessarily be that, might be Polish resistance fighters. It's just the general impression of chaos and the possibility of sudden violent death coming out of anywhere. So we are plunged into a totally nihilistic environment that hadn't really been seen in Polish cinema up to then, hadn't really been seen in most other national cinemas. And it directly anticipates the likes of Ellen Klimov's Come and See in 1985, and much more recently, Václav Machul's The Painted Bird. Now, unlike Roman Polanski, who had childhood memories of World War II, and of course he would eventually make his own World War II film, somewhat belatedly, in The Pianist, and Vida, who had teenage memories of World War II. Żuławski was only 5 when the war ended, and so instead the events or the fact-based events in the third part of the night are drawn on the memories of his father, who was the co-screenwriter. Mirosław Żuławski, he hadn't seen all his family murdered, but he had lost a daughter as a result of a bomb in Lviv in 1941. He had also one of the film's most literally skin-crawling details is the whole notion of people renting out their parts of their bodies for lice to feed on in order to help develop vaccines. Now, this sounds like the kind of thing that would come from a sort of a particularly imaginative screenwriter's the darkest recesses of their psyche, but in fact it actually happens to Mirosław Żuławski. He did indeed rent his body out for a time for lice investigation, and when he was working for the Institute for Typhus Research. In fact, the lice-based research is one of the very few concrete World War II specific details. The thing about a lot of Polish World War II films is they do assume a basic knowledge on the part of the audience. For example, you're watching the Vida War trilogy without knowing in advance who the Polish Home Army are. Well, that's knowledge that would definitely have been possessed by pretty much every domestic viewer of the film. And in fact, Vida was relying on this because he wasn't actually allowed to mention the Polish Home Army by name for various convoluted reasons to do with them being anti-Soviet, which didn't go down too well with the then communist government. The third part of the night, by contrast, there are very few concrete details. The Gestapo I mentioned by name, but otherwise it's just this atmosphere of complete chaos. You just have to accept that this is taking place in a world where civilization is on the brink of collapse, and this is very much the kind of environment that Żuławski also created in The Devil and extraterrestrially in On the Silver Globe. Michał is played by Leszek Teleszyński, a stage actor who was actually making his debut in front of a camera, although Żuławski clearly liked his performance enough to cast him in fact, virtually identical part, apart from the beard, in The Devil. There's also a name actor in the cast that you might recognise in Jan Nowicki, who plays Michał's wife's doppelganger Martha's husband. He's Jan Nowicki, who probably best known for playing the lead in Jerzy Skolimowski's Barrier in 1966, and a couple of years later, after Third Part of the Night, in Wojciech Has's similarly hallucinatory The Hourglass Sanatorium, where he's very much the Michał character. And also have a slightly more benign, nonetheless equally warped vision of Poland gone mad. Right from the start, Żuławski's headlong plunge approach into his mise-en-scène demanded a camera team of unusual versatility. The lighting cameraman was Witold Sobocinski, who had already had experience of handling decidedly avant-garde material when he lit Jerzy Skolimowski's Hands Up a few years earlier. And shortly after Third Part of the Night, he would do Andrzej Wajda's The Wedding, a considerably weirder and less sedate film than that title would suggest, and the Hourglass Sanatorium, which I've just mentioned, by Wojciech Has. Sobocinski's camera operator, Maciej Kijowski, is the real virtuoso here, because he was required to do the kind of shots that these days would be carried out on a Steadicam, but of course he didn't have access to that kind of technology and had to do it all largely handheld. And he achieved some really extraordinary results. I'm thinking particularly of a really prolonged shot where the camera tracks backwards down a really dark underground corridor as Michał walks towards it. And an even more important contributor, not least because he would go on to score all of Żuławski's Polish films, including Siemanka in the 1990s, as well as Possession and La Fidelité, is the composer Andrzej Korzinski, whose overtly electronic score is wildly out of step with the period. But it doesn't matter. In fact, in many ways, it's very appropriate, because it's a permanent reminder that this may ostensibly be a World War II drama, but it's just as much happening in Żuławski's mind as it is in real life Nazi-occupied Poland. Now, the film's reception was, to put it mildly, stormy. There had really never been a film quite like The Third Part of the Night shown in Poland. In fact, although there was quite a bit of avant-garde experimentalism in Polish cinema in fields such as animation and even documentary, there had been very, very little of it in the equivalent of mainstream features. There's Tadeusz Konwicki's The Last Day of Summer in 1958. There's Jerzy Skolimowski's Polish films, particularly Barrier 1966 and Hands Up in 1967, but really very little else. And people really didn't know what to make of it at first. And in some cases, they were very clear that they didn't like what they could make of it. One of the film's critics was Żuławski's old boss, Andrzej Wajda, who he was impressed by the film. He clearly felt that his protege had real talent, and that this talent was really, really obvious throughout. But he also felt that he should rein it in a bit, and maybe there was scope for a bit of stipping and restructuring and so on and so forth. To which Żuławski responded, "Wiesz, wybacz, ale to jest mój film I posadził się w dupie," which, apologies for the pronunciation, but that translates as, "Excuse me, this is my film, and you can stick that up your ass." However, Wajda doesn't seem to have been too affronted by this, because one of the first things you see in the opening titles of The Devil, Żuławski's second feature, is that it was produced by the X-Film Unit, which was Wajda's own outfit, so thus making Wajda the de facto executive producer. And of course, it undoubtedly helped having someone like Wajda championing the film, because that at least helped it get off the ground in the first place, even if it ran into serious trouble later on.